Okay, we're going to talk about queercore or the so-called queercore, homocore scene. The main progenitors of the punk scene in Los Angeles in the 70s were, first of all, women and queers. But then things shifted and became more macho, more boys club, more just icky. There were those of us who kind of felt sort of alienated in that we were too gay for this new punk scene, that we were too punk for the gay world. And so there were those of us here in Los Angeles and other major cities like Toronto, San Francisco, New York, London, who just started to, create their own little thing. And it was something that was just done very organically. We said that these were the queer punk bars, but they were basically hustler bars and dive bars. I acted like it was a huge scene of people, and every night there was like an amazing event to go to. And it was just hyperbole, But it's funny that just by my saying these things, it sprang up. And thus it came to be, like magic. And that's a thing that people can do now. If there's something that's lacking, if you're seeking a scene, you have to first envision it. And then it can become a reality.
So that was just a short clip from this video, kind of as an introduction to self-described blacktress and punk drag performer Vaginal Cream Davis, or Dr. Davis, as she sometimes calls herself. So this is a specific scene in Los Angeles, and she performs in many other cities, but this is kind of her route. And this is a very different kind of drag or of a queer trans scene than we've looked at so far. So in the Munoz reading, we see him read into her style of drag and what that kind of performance means. And so make sure you do read the Munoz reading for our discussion on Friday. So please watch the rest of this clip. It's about 6 minutes and it's kind of a short introduction into this queercore punk trans POC scene. Just one note for content that there is a use of a transphobic slur. It is used by a trans person, but just a heads up. So in this, she describes the creation of a particular scene. And I do like this quote, if you're seeking a scene, you have to first envision it and it can become a reality. So we often associate punk with people like the Sex Pistols or the Clash. So a lot of like white, earlier on working class, but white heterosexual masculinity. And she kind of describes punk in a different way because there really is nothing more punk than a black trans drag performer. And so we do see elements of punk, elements of drag, of theater, of performance, of what they would call genderfuck, all kind of mixed up in a similar scene. And of course, as we've looked at with all these other kind of ethnographies into drag scenes, every city will have its own little microcosm. And so that's why it's important to look at things in their historical and social geographical context. So the kinds of drag performance that we see through Vaginal Cream Davis's work are very different and are explicitly political. And so we do see her coming out of this queercore punk scene. So we won't be looking at queercore in this class, but if you're interested, I suggest you look at some of the history of queercore if you want to know some more background information. So I won't go too deeply into her work because I want to talk about it as a class on Friday, but this is where Munoz gets the title for his chapter on Vaginal Cream Davis. Vaginal Davis used to be a 6'6" black drag queen, not anymore. Now she's taking male hormones, she's lightening her skin, she's joined the Idaho militia, she's an angry white male, she's got the white to be angry. So obviously she's not advocating for changing herself into a white right wing angry male, but she's kind of using this language to really explicitly critique white supremacist masculinity. And this is a really important form of politicized drag, where she uses her body as an instrument to talk back to these major forms of oppression. So not just in the punk scene, but as Munoz talks about in his chapter, we see her create um, these performances where she has her own drag character, um, who is a white supremacist, and uses this performance to talk back to these major systems of oppression. So this terrorist drag of Vaginal Cream Davis is kind of what is being highlighted in the article or in the chapter by Jose Esteban Munoz, who, as an aside, was a very important kind of self-described punk cultural critic. And if you have a chance to read any of his work, I highly recommend it. So she is a multidimensional performance artist. In her performances, has used things like drag, creation of zines. She's a musician, and she's a cultural critic. She's been invited to many universities to talk about her work and to talk about the importance of drag performance as a political statement. Um, so she was a part of this Los Angeles punk scene, as she says, of women, queer and trans people of color. And this idea of a terrorist drag, Munoz describes as a queerer modality of performance that is not interested or invested in passing. So she's not trying to, quote unquote, look like a woman. She's not trying to really look like anything legible or obvious. She's mixing in many different elements to perform, to critique, to satirize major systems of oppression, white supremacy, misogyny, trans misogyny, without this investment in trying to look like one particular gender. And so we can call this punk rock or political drag, and it's very much counter and sometimes even contradictory to mainstream representations of drag, which Munoz, says we can call it sanitized, assimilationist, and depoliticized. So of course there's arguments that anytime a queer or trans person takes on a drag performance, that it can be seen as political, but it's not inherently a political action. So we can kind of see her work and people who are also her contemporaries really challenging the notions of gay and lesbian assimilation. The idea that to be equal with kind of straight society is what queer and trans people should want. It is about highlighting the differences of queer and trans, and particularly queer and trans people of color, the communities, the politics, and pushing back against the notion that that drag is just an aesthetic. So in her performances, she mocks white supremacists. And she uses this and demonstrates a figure that is potentially threatening to people of color. She takes that figure of the white supremacist and reveals it as a joke. So in her persona, when she plays this white supremacist character, Clarence, she does what drag does, which is highlight the performativity of um, such a presentation. So showing things like white macho racist masculinity to be another performance, to be something that can be undone. So these performances are meant to create discomfort around race, gender, and sexuality. And so in the article, Munoz talks about this as a tactical rather misrecognition. So it's meant to be illegible. It's meant to make people think. It's meant to make people question their presumptions around race, around gender, and around these kind of figures of queer terror. So the figure of the white trash masculinity, the gun-loving right-wing homophobe, and she reveals these characteristics to be also performative. And through doing so, she kind of takes them apart and undoes them. So in this, Munoz says that she performs the nation's internal terrors around race, gender, and sexuality. She even, interestingly enough, she will perform using things like blackface. And so we might think this is, you know, kind of a moot point because she herself is black, but she will paint her face white and then perform blackface on top of that to recycle it to show again the performativity, the ridiculousness of this kind of historical pantomime, racist pantomime of Black people. So she also does this to connect more contemporary, more present forms of racism and shows that they have a long history. So instead of saying that, you know, this form of racism, such as blackface, is something from the past, she shows how this lineage of racism, of, um, of white supremacist articulations of racist of racist presentations of blackness, she shows it as having a historical lineage and disidentifies with it to present it as something that is performative, as something that is ridiculous. And you can kind of see clips of her doing things like this on YouTube if you just take some time to do some um, snooping around there. So she is really critiquing this the kind of racist white male hegemony, and in doing so is performing a kind of politicized drag that I think is very important to center, particularly now that drag has become so mainstream. So she wants to make her audience uncomfortable, particularly her white audience, people coming to her shows. She wants people in the crowd to think about their own um, contribution, their own complicity in these systems of oppression. So finally, we're going to end looking at some contemporary drag scenes in Vancouver. So I'm going to provide a few clips for you to watch after I do a brief introduction to these scenes. The clips will be in order after this section of the lecture, so you can have a look at some of the kind of inside perspectives of these scenes. So Man Up is the longest running drag show in the city, was established in 2008. Until COVID, it was a monthly show. It started off as a drag king show and has kind of morphed into this multi-gendered queer performance, incorporating things like burlesque, incorporating queens and kings, non-binary things. We have contortion, we have all styles of dance, music, and also highlighting, because we've talked about drag houses, the House of Rice, which is an all Asian drag queen house, drag house that is founded by Shady Or, who's a local performer. And since 2018, they've been producing this show called Rice Cake, which is an all Asian queer dance party. So hopefully, when COVID ends, you can check it out. Featuring, you know, all Asian DJs, dancers, go-go's, voguers, drag performers, etc. And when we end the class, we will be watching from a film, Yellow Peril, Queer Destiny, that is kind of a biography of Made in China, who's one of the members of the House of Rice and Shady Or's first drag child.